Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
I'm Katie Rife.
Today we're going to be talking about Frozen 2, the sequel to the Disney smash, and also A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, starring Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers.
Welcome to a new season of Film Club. So Alex, to kick off our new season of Film Club, we're going to talk about a movie that I think a lot of parents in particular are going to see this holiday season, whether they really want to or not. That is Frozen 2, the sequel to the record-setting, gigantic Disney blockbuster. I don't have any children, real close to me in my life, yet I still have heard all of the songs from this film.
That's right. Well, that's how big of a hit the first Frozen was. It's now the biggest animated movie of all time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have kids either, but I think both of us grew up in the sort of age of the Disney Renaissance.
Absolutely.
Films like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and The Lion King. And the original Frozen, in some respects, felt like a throwback to those films that was also sort of lightly progressive in some ways. I felt like it got a lot of attention for breaking in very small and I would say somewhat superficial ways from the older politics of Disney films.
Sure, yeah. It uses the sort of like princess and the magical kingdom conceit of a fairy tale, but in it being more about the relationship between the sisters than about a handsome prince. Aside from the thing that I think is pretty well established in American film at this point, which is that the princess doesn't need to be saved. Even by the time the first Frozen came out, that was pretty well established. So I think that the most progressive part of the original is emphasizing the relationship of the sisters over romantic relationships.
For sure. So I sort of felt like the original was lightly progressive in some ways, but it was also traditionalist in other ways, which made it a perfect film for sort of millennial parents as well, which I think might account for one of the reasons why it was such a big hit. The sequel, I think, in many ways kind of replicates a lot of the things that people loved about the original without quite recapturing the magic of that film.
Yeah, and one way to me that the parallel seemed really obvious was in the structure of it musically. Each song serves a specific purpose in furthering the plot. Like you have your inciting incident song, and then your all is lost song, and then the resolution song. That was very similar. Obviously, Let It Go was the huge thing from the original Frozen. And in this film, based on radio ads and marketing, I think they're going to try to push Into the Unknown as the big musical number from Frozen 2, which makes sense to me because I think it's the most memorable song in the movie.
Oh, it's easily the most memorable. I think it's the best song in the movie. And one of the only that I think has any chance of enduring the way that song or even something like Do You Want to Build a Snowman from the original endured.
Well, I'll be really interested to see how this plays out because Into the Unknown, Idina Menzel sings the songs as Elsa again. Her vocal range in that song is very difficult. So it's a tough one to karaoke. So I'll be interested to see how that affects its enduring qualities because people love to sing Let It Go. So that one's going to be harder to pull off.
There's going to be a lot of failed attempts at this one, I feel like,
totally.
at karaoke bars.
Yeah, totally.
The story, it sends them on another adventure this time. I think that this one is built so much on the template of the original that a lot of it is about filling in things that the original didn't give us.
Sure.
Like if you care a lot about how Elsa got her magic powers, good news.
Or why she has magic powers.
Or why she has magic powers. Other sort of unexplained aspects of the backstory in the original, this will fill it in. I don't find that necessarily to be the most satisfying approach to a sequel. I will also admit that I may not be the target audience for this film. That there are kids who might be very excited to see how Elsa became a superhero.
It's of a piece with the Frozen movie's sort of overall project of lightly deconstructing the myth of fairy tales because it's always a given that a character has powers and they don't really explain why. So I think that's of a piece with its overall sort of project. And also, I loved how you said lightly progressive to describe the first film earlier because that's how I felt about this one. Because on the one hand, I was a little bit pleasantly surprised to find that a major plot point in this film revolves around Elsa and Anna's grandfather screwing over the film's Native American proxy in sort of a colonialist gesture. And their big conflict in the film is they have to fix the sins of the past, which is a really interesting sort of point of view for kids today who have a lot of challenges they're facing, like the environmental crisis, that's all about kids fixing the sins of their parents and their grandparents.
Totally.
So I think that's a very interesting plot point to put into a mainstream kids movie, but at the same time, it absolves the characters of any sort of racist or greedy sins.
Yeah, well, I think beyond that, it's a film about consequences that doesn't actually ask its characters to face any real consequences.
Right.
And maybe that's to be expected from something that's aimed at children and families. the last thing you want to do over Thanksgiving, families going out to see Frozen 2, is bum out the whole family,
Sure.
you know?
Although, you know what, like Thanksgiving, you know, maybe it would be a good opportunity for parents to talk to their kids about what happened in the history of America with real Native Americans,
Yes.
you know?
It would be a sort of an opportune conversation starter if the movie were that interested in that.
Exactly.
I think ultimately I thought this was very well animated as well. I think it's nice to see the amount of effort and creativity that went into the creation of this world again. I mean, it's maybe a high water mark for Disney in that respect.
I thought the animation was wonderful. We both see a lot of kind of cheapy kids movies as part of our job. Watching this movie really hammered home to me how bad the animation is in most kids animated movies, how lazy it is. It's just so much more textured than most animation that you see. Like fur looks like fur and water looks like water. And these are just details that aren't covered in most of these films. I thought it was very interesting they had a whole lighting unit to make the directional lighting correct and things like that. I just really appreciate it. I thought there were some really nice imaginative touches. Like there's a sequence towards the end where they go to sort of the mythical cave where all the secrets of their kingdom are kept. And there's some cool imaginative animation in there, you know, incorporating like snowflake crystal designs into the animation that I thought was kind of cool.
What I couldn't help think of, though, honestly, is that there, and this is true, I think, of a lot of animated films and a lot of contemporary animated films, is that there's just this enormous chasm between the effort level of the people who do the animation for these movies and the thought that went into the script and went into the story. And because I ultimately
and the jokes.
Yeah, and into the jokes. I mean, there's just this enormous, I find myself thinking about this room of animators toiling away for years, and writers who spent, I mean, I'm sure the writers spent a long time on it too, but it often doesn't feel that way, honestly. This feels like something that was written by committee and that has been specifically designed to echo the pleasures of the last film without, in my opinion, enhancing them.
Yeah, I mean, I would counter that I think that it was probably more focused grouped to death as opposed to lazy. It was so overdone that it ended up looking generic rather than just slapped together quickly with something generic.
Excuse me, I climbed the North Mountain, survived a frozen heart, and saved you from my ex-boyfriend, and I did it all without powers. So, you know, I'm coming.
Me too. I'll drive.
I'll bring the snacks!
Let's pivot to the second movie we're going to talk about this week, and I think it could actually siphon, who are we kidding? It's not going to siphon any business off Frozen 2, but if you're a parent going to the theater with your kids and you can't get into Frozen 2 because it's all sold out, there is another movie in theaters about a beloved children's entertainer. I would say at this point kind of a national hero, Mr. Rogers.
Yes.
And he is played by Tom Hanks.
He's been canonized on the internet for sure.
He certainly has, So you were a big fan of director Mariel Heller's last movie, Can You Ever Forgive Me?
Yes, I thought it was a wonderful vehicle for Melissa McCarthy, who's a talent who I don't think that her potential had really been tapped in that way before that, and the rapport between her and Richard E. Grant in the movie. I just thought that movie was wonderful. This one I did not like nearly as much.
Okay.
I think part of that has to do with expectations. I think that the distributor is kind of setting this movie up for a negative reaction by billing it as a Mr. Rogers biopic, which it is definitely not.
Is that such a bad thing, though? I mean, do we want a biopic about all of Mr. Rogers' life? I mean, last year
it'd be kind of boring.
I don't think he lived a terribly exciting life. I mean, he was in show business and he was not a sniper. The movie does acknowledge that bit of that myth about him.
Yes, he did sue the KKK though. That's real.
Is that in the movie as well?
No, it's not in the movie, but that's a real fact about Mr. Rogers. That you probably could film a,
you could probably work into a
around
biopic.
that. Yeah.
I was kind of grateful watching it that it didn't turn into a biopic.
Interesting. Okay.
For one thing, because we have the documentary from last year about Mr. Rogers that was very well received.
That was a pretty good documentary.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good. It covers the scope. Yeah. Totally.
I liked it.
And it covers the scope of his career, and I don't know if we need a dramatization of those events. I think this takes, I don't know about a smarter approach, because I think it also takes an approach that feels a little cliche to me as well, which is we're going to look at Mr. Rogers, we're going to look at the legacy of Mr. Rogers and his value as a public entertainer through the lens of his relationship to a grumpy journalist.
Right.
You know, the film is based on this Esquire article from the late 90s. This writer was sort of assigned to go profile him for an issue. He's played by Matthew Rhys from The Americans. And he goes, and the film becomes about this relationship that he develops between Mr. Rogers, but also about his relationship to his father, who he's been estranged with.
Specifically, it's how Mr. Rogers helps him reconcile with his father.
Which I think is a slightly hackneyed dramatic device.
Well, particularly, like, I don't want a gritty Mr. Rogers biopic, but the way that Mr. Rogers is depicted in this movie is very much in line with his popular canonization.
100%. But I will say that it does get occasionally into how frustrating it would be to try to interview somebody like Mr. Rogers.
Sure, yes. He keeps turning the questions back on him.
Yeah, and I think the movie suggests at a certain point that that's its own form of evasion. And one of the smarter things I think about the film is this suggestion that Mr. Rogers was somebody who used kindness as a front and as a way to occasionally deflect. The movie does play into the cult of Mr. Rogers as this figure of pure
Is like a
kindness.
magical person. You know,
He's a fairy godfather character in this movie.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kind of like another film that cast Tom Hanks as a real person, Saving Mr. Banks.
Yeah.
And in that movie, he's playing Walt Disney, and I think his version of Disney, too, is Print the Legend, you know?
Right. Well, Disney was a more complex person than
Indeed.
Mr. Rogers.
Yes. That's the thing about Mr. Rogers is I think that he actually lives up to his reputation. What did you think about Hanks in the role?
I thought Hanks's performance was a little mannered, actually,
okay.
in a way that, you know, was definitely heartfelt, but didn't fully translate to me as like a real person. Although that may be a side effect of what you were talking about, the sort of subtextual element of the film where Mr. Rogers would use his public persona as a way of avoiding actually talking about himself. There is a certain guardedness in the way that he plays the role, in that like he has all of the surface mannerisms you would expect from Mr. Rogers, but you definitely feel like he's concealing something.
It feels very deliberate to me, to be honest. I quite like Hanks in the role, and I think one reason I like him is that Heller is not attempting to coax a real impression out of Tom Hanks.
Right.
Tom Hanks is not a chameleon as an actor.
He's similarly beloved like Mr. Rogers, so it was smart casting to put him in the role, because I think people respond to Tom Hanks in a similar way they respond to Mr. Rogers.
Yes, I think that's 100% what the movie is doing, is it's using Hanks's persona, Hanks's kind of wholesome Americanness, as a proxy for Mr. Rogers. It's saying there's no way we're going to get somebody who can actually convey the depth of feeling and who can recapture the audience's relationship to Fred Rogers. So we need somebody who can kind of fill in for him.
Who has his own relationship with the audience.
Yes, exactly. So the audience is bringing their own connection to Hanks, and it's sort of filling in for the relationship they have with Mr. Rogers, which I think is really savvy.
Well, one thing I did really like about this movie, I wasn't expecting it to have these like heavily meta at some point sequences, because how much screen time does Hanks have in this movie? Maybe a half hour?
20 minutes maybe?
20 minutes?
Yeah, he doesn't have a lot.
Yeah, not a lot of screen time, but they inject a little bit of that Mr. Rogers quality into other parts of the film by having miniatures of the different cities.
Yeah, using those for the establishing shots, you know? So we're seeing New York, but we're seeing a miniature version of New York.
Like a Mr. Rogers style miniature of New York. The implication is that this is like a sketch on on a Mr. Rogers episode. We're learning a lesson.
Yeah, totally. Bit. I'm kind of mixed on that device. I mean, I found it. I thought it was a weird touch.
It is weird. It wasn't what I was expecting.
It's a weird touch, but I also think it's occasionally kind of hokey too. There's a dream sequence at one point in the film that sticks Matthew Rhys's character into the fantasy, the puppet fantasy land within Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, which I found a little hokey. Ultimately, though, I think this tries to get at some of Mr. Rogers' appeal and some of his philosophy as a public performer, and I appreciated that about it.
I will give it credit for trying to take a different approach than straight biopic, because I think you could easily have made a straight tearjerker biopic that people would have really loved. When I'm saying that I think that they're setting it up for a negative reaction, I don't mean that it like reflects poorly on the film itself. I mean that people are gonna be like, well, that wasn't a Mr. Rogers biopic, and there might be some disappointment there.
Do you think people are gonna be less interested in seeing Matthew Rhys reconcile with his mean father?
Than a American hero playing another American hero? Yeah. Maybe a little bit.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine?
Well, that's all we've got for this episode of Film Club. Please be sure to check out the podcast version of Film Club and rate, review, and subscribe however you are joining us every week to talk about the latest films. And we also have another podcast called Dial M for Maple. It's all about Riverdale. And we will see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.